There's been a concern for around the world about over-reliance on American technology, but I think having a frontier model actually switched off for foreign nationals is probably as big a wake-up call as you could get.
Hello and welcome to Fortune AI Weekly. I'm Jeremy Kahn, Fortune's AI editor.
And I'm B. Nolan, Fortune's AI reporter.
Fortune AI Weekly is a brand new vodcast here at Fortune. We're going to be trying to bring you all the news from the last week in AI. What are people talking about in the industry, and what does it mean? Fortune AI Weekly is brought to you by ServiceNow. ServiceNow's AI specialists do the work, start to finish, so people can do the parts of the job they're best at. To learn more, visit servicenow.com. So B, I think the biggest news for sure this week was the restoration of Anthropic's Fable AI model. This is the model that had been subject to export controls for the past 2 weeks. For those who've been living under a rock for the last 2 weeks, do you want to tell people, what was Fable? What's been going on with Fable?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a bit of a hectic 2 weeks. So for anyone that wasn't covering it or watching it as closely as we were, Anthropic released this model more than 2 weeks ago. It was part of sort of this higher class of mythos models that were had increased capabilities on things like cybersecurity that worried both Anthropic and the US government about national security concerns. But Fable 5, Anthropic released that to the general public with a lot of safeguards. So people couldn't ask it things like, help me launch a cyber attack or help me build a bioweapon or any of that. It had very strict safeguards.
Fable is mythos with safeguards, right?
Yeah, it's mythos with some quite hefty safeguards. I think there was some complaints at the time that the safeguards were really intense. So that it was even throwing back quite benign requests. So very overcautious safeguards at this point. But I think the public only had it for about 4 days before it was slapped with these export controls, which basically ordered that no foreign nationals were allowed to use these models. And the reason why the US government did that was because they felt like they had seen a jailbreak where people could sort of unlock these really dangerous capabilities. Anthropic didn't agree. They thought that jailbreak was more general and could be done with a lot of models. And yeah, the last 2 weeks have kind of been an impasse of that exact debate.
So how did this all get resolved then?
Well, we don't know too much about the details about what the negotiations were, but it's been sort of heading this way for a while. A few days ago, the US government allowed Fable 5 to be used by certain organizations. I think it was 100 organizations. And now this is a broader launch or relaunch of this public model. I mean, one good thing is that I think a lot of people were worried that when it was relaunched to the public, it would only be relaunched to American citizens as the sort of export. That's where the export controls came from. But we haven't seen that so far. But Anthropic has put in some extra safeguards, they've said.
Right. And I guess the big question is where this leaves us now. And basically we're in this weird situation where the US government has this kind of ad hoc licensing regime, but it's not saying it has a licensing regime, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like people, this is the only thing to take from it. They've done a similar thing to OpenAI's recent class of models. They're still being held back by the government and can only be released to Trump-approved customers. So I don't know how the government is going about vetting these things. They say there might be a framework coming soon, and maybe it's a 2-week process, but there's a little bit of a lack of transparency and confusion about what needs to be vetted and what doesn't need to be vetted.
Right. So now we're in this sort of worst of all world situation, right? You have some sort of licensing regime that's completely opaque. It seems like the rules are being made up on the fly. As you said, there's reporting that they are working on something that is going to be more of an explicit framework that might be more transparent, but that hasn't been announced yet. So for the moment, we have this very opaque situation. Yeah, I think there's, it's a fascinating situation, right? There's lots of implications of this. One of the things that you've written about before, B, is that companies during this period when these export controls were imposed, I think a lot of companies and a lot of countries, it was a real wake up call that maybe they shouldn't depend on these frontier AI models from the American labs, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's been a concern for around the world about over-reliance on American technology, but I think having a frontier model actually switched off for foreign nationals is probably as big a wake-up call as you could get. But I mean, in terms of companies as well, it's complicated because if this is how the US government is going to approach models as they come out, companies are international themselves. I mean, people have teams in London and in other parts of the world. And so what does it say if you're relying on a model that the US government might start restricting or things like that? I don't know how you think that companies should be kind of thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the companies I've talked to, they're definitely moving to this kind of model agnostic mindset anyway, and trying to architect their systems so that they can swap in any model. And they were doing that partly because the model capabilities kept changing. But I think some of these issues around, are they actually going to be able to rely on a particular model from a particular company, really come to the fore. And that this whole situation with Anthropic's Mythos and Fable models has really hammered that home for a lot of companies. One of the things you're hearing people talk about is maybe they'll go to using more open source models. But of course, this is a little problematic because the world's leading open source models are all from Chinese companies. There's certainly a kind of a stigma and concern in the West about using those models. And then there's also some talk about, like, are we going to see some kind of regulation imposed around open source as well? I mean, what are you hearing, B?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a push towards like having control of your own models. There are European and other open source alternatives to Chinese models. There's Mistral in France, and Cohere which is a Canadian company that sort of have more open source models. But I think that companies are increasingly leaning towards this. It feels like you have more control. Like if you're going to build all your workflows on top of one technology, you want to be sure that it's not one day going to disappear when you arrive at work.
You recently interviewed the CEO of Cohere, right? And that was one of the things he was trying to get across, is that maybe you want to look at some of these other models from non-US providers, including maybe Cohere, maybe Mistral.
Yeah, and also this push towards like more collaboration between sort of like as companies outside of the US-China access on this kind of thing, just to give yourself a bit more safety in case this kind of stuff happens again.
Now we're seeing a lot of these Chinese open source models. They're getting pretty good. They're still sort of not quite at the frontier, but there were some interesting headlines this week about a particular model called GLM 5.2 from a company called Z.AI. Can you tell us a little about what the story was with that model?
Yeah, I mean, the headlines kind of were like this Chinese, it's a Chinese company, open source, and the headlines kind of were like, oh, this is kind of matched like Anthropic's Mythos tier capability and this cybersecurity stuff. But I think, I mean, we were talking about this, like if you read a little bit in between the lines, it's like not quite what it's made out to be. What did you make of the story?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. This was a report in the Wall Street Journal, which quoted some cybersecurity researchers saying that this Z.AI, which goes sometimes by Z.AI model GLM 5.2, that it was as capable as Anthropic's Mythos 5 model. But then the actual capability they talked about was the ability to find vulnerabilities in software code, which, as we just saw with this whole debate about the export controls, is a capability that like a lot of the top models now have. There are many of these advanced models, including those that have not been subject to any controls from the American government, that have the ability to find vulnerabilities in software. And I think what people are really worried about with Mythos is not just the finding of the vulnerabilities, but actually then running a full exploit autonomously of those vulnerabilities. And it's not clear, from at least from the Wall Street Journal's reporting, that this is something that GLM 5.2 can do. It might be able to find some of the flaws. It's not totally clear that it can exploit them. It's certainly not clear it can exploit them autonomously. So I think this idea that this model is actually as capable as Mythos, it was a bit of a, I don't know, I don't think that headline was exactly accurate.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I feel like we've been hearing that even when Mythos was released initially. Like there were a lot of people saying, a lot of open source models can find a lot of the vulnerabilities that Mythos has found. It's about this kind of, taking advantage of them.
So other big news this week, one thing we're tracking is this story about OpenAI going to the U.S. government and asking the U.S. government to invest some sort of stake, taking some sort of stake in OpenAI. There was a report in the Financial Times that they're talking to the government about taking 5%. Maybe they're trying to get ahead of this legislation that Bernie Sanders has tried to introduce, which might claim a much larger equity stake in AI companies in some sort of sovereign wealth fund that the U.S. government would control. Sanders was talking about a 50% stake in those companies. Yeah, what do you make of this story, B?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I feel like it's been around for a while. Like now we've got a number, which I think is the main news, like the 5% is the newest bit. But Trump said this before, that he's considering doing this, like taking an equity stake in these companies. It's interesting timing for sure. It's also interesting to me that it's kind of like of the policies are very different between what OpenAI is suggesting and what Bernie Sanders is suggesting. But it's interesting to me that there's a cross-aisle consensus, like that maybe we need to take some investment in these companies and like basically make sure Americans reap some of the rewards of AI. I think Bernie Sanders was suggesting a 50% ownership. So it's different. But I don't know. How much do you think this has to do with like their backlash against AI at the moment?
No, I think absolutely from OpenAI's perspective, this is a way they think they're going to somewhat mute the backlash against AI in the US, is if they can give everyone an ownership stake in them and all the other leading labs, then people will, not view AI as negatively. I'm not sure that's totally true, but it certainly might help. And I think it's very interesting that we're just starting to talk about these kind of sovereign wealth funds. And you're absolutely right that there's this kind of cross-aisle consensus around this idea of what's sometimes called pre-distribution. So rather than trying to redistribute wealth after the fact through taxes, you try to pre-distribute wealth by giving people shares in companies that are then hopefully going to rise in value and allow everyone to kind of profit from that. Of course, it's not totally clear if you have a sovereign wealth fund exactly how redistributive that is. So the government controls that fund. It's not really clear what they do with the proceeds from that fund and whether that would really benefit all Americans or not. Yes, technically it's a government fund, so it sort of belongs to everyone. But I still think in terms of people individually feeling like they're getting some benefit from this technology, it's not clear to me like how you do that unless there is a kind of universal basic income that you're somehow funding out of this fund. And that those details haven't been worked out yet.
Yeah, there are a lot of unanswered questions around this, and like who would control this fund and sit on the board. And like, I feel like it's very early days on this, but it does sound like it's moving a bit further down the line. I mean, the reporting in the FT said that Sam Altman was meeting Trump and Howard Lucknick already about this. So maybe we will see something in the near future.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this story is it looks like it's actually going to something is going to happen, which it was very unclear when this story first surfaced going back several months ago. And you have had JD Vance, the vice president. He was on a podcast in which he said, he's in favor of this idea and the president's very much in favor of this idea. So I do think, yeah, something definitely could happen here.
Yeah, and I think you can't underestimate the AI backlash role that maybe this is playing. And I mean, obviously, Altman's home was attacked as part of some of this like rising tide against AI at the moment. And with all the data center build out as well, it seems like it's getting worse, not better. So anything that companies can do at the moment to try and feel like the public, are benefiting from this technology as well is probably strategically good for OpenAI at the moment.
No, absolutely. What else do you have your eye on this week, B?
We were also talking about some of these compute stories. There's been a few. I think Meta, they're thinking about selling their excess compute, which did good things for their stock and bad things for the neocloud stock.
Meta has a ton of compute and they're building out some very large data centers, as are some of the other hyperscalers, other cloud providers. And as you say, there are all these neoclouds, these new cloud providers, people like CoreWeave, people like Nebius, and some others out there who are looking to make money off of selling cloud services for AI to companies. And all of those stocks kind of got hit. We also had this story this week that Google is so capacity constrained that it was actually Meta had been using some Google cloud compute, and Google told Meta apparently that it couldn't use all of the compute that it initially had allocated to them because Google needed it itself. What do you make of this? I'm actually very confused by that story.
Yeah, I mean, I was as well. I mean, we had this story that Google was kind of throttling some of the compute it was giving to Meta. I think it was helping Meta with things like some of its content moderation and things like this in terms of compute power. I'm not sure that the Meta thing, when I was looking into it, that there was a lot of details about exactly how they were going to go about that. And I know it's something Mark Zuckerberg has mentioned before. Like he actually mentioned that he might do this back in last year at some point. To me, it just shows that the big issue at the moment is this compute constraint, and it doesn't matter how big a giant you are. It doesn't matter if you're Google or Meta. Like this is the real constraint at the moment.
Yeah, and it might mean that the market's kind of overreacted to this Meta news about it potentially selling, or renting out some of its capacity. But the market seems very reactive to stories in general. We also had this other story this week where OpenAI, there was a report, a story in the Information that was very thin on details that OpenAI had achieved some kind of breakthrough in optimizing how it runs AI models on its computing infrastructure, potentially cutting in half the amount of compute it had to use for certain processes. And this totally tanked the stocks of a number of chip makers. Again, I guess with investors saying, oh, well, if they're that much more efficient at running AI models, maybe you aren't going to need all these computer chips. But it was strange to me that like there were almost no details about what this breakthrough is, how real is it, and yet the market really tanked these stocks.
Yeah, again, I feel like the market is just very nervy towards any of this stuff at the moment. I mean, the OpenAI thing is super interesting if it is what it's laid out to be. Like, it was a little light on details. I think there was even a detail that OpenAI wasn't even sharing the details of the breakthrough it had with its staff because it was so worried about it leaking. It didn't want other labs to get a hold of this information. And it's very much testing. Like, this is still a test process. So how far down the line we are with this, I'm not quite sure yet.
Yeah, no, I think we'll have to put that one down in the interesting, if true, category of news.
Yeah,
Which
definitely.
there is a fair bit of in the AI world.
Especially in this industry.
Absolutely. All right. Well, now we're going to move on to the last segment of the show, which we call Brain Food. For those of you who subscribe to Fortune's Eye on AI newsletter, you'll know that this is also the last section of the Tuesday send of the newsletter, where we just sort of talk about some other interesting things happening in the AI industry or among the kind of AI related topics. B, maybe you want to introduce this one. You had picked up on this report that Ramp, many of you may know it, but it's a company that helps businesses manage their expenses, manage their financial spend, particularly travel and expense reporting. But as a result, they have a lot of insight, right, into what companies are spending money on, including the AI models that they're spending money on. What was this Ramp study showing?
Well, it was interesting because they'd sort of matched up the actual AI vendor spending by companies with the employment data at the same time. I think they did over 20,000 firms or something, so it was a relatively large study. The kind of headline finding was that like the more companies adopt and invest in AI, the more they hire. And this came with like several caveats because obviously that sounds a little bit counterintuitive to everything we've been hearing.
Yeah, it sounds completely counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, I mean, Ramp themselves said that this should be seen as like a correlation rather than a causation thing, and there were several other things they pointed out, like these gains took a while, and there's this thing where people who are adopting AI very quickly are often AI companies themselves, very VC backed, also hiring at the same time. But yeah, I know you had some thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So B had reported on this study, but I was very skeptical of it, I have to say, because I thought exactly what B just said, that it's really hard to tease out correlation and any kind of causation here, because they said that the companies that were the heaviest adopters and also were seeing this hiring tended to be, tech companies, tended to be AI native companies. And a lot of those companies, as B says, they're venture backed and they're kind of in hyper growth mode anyway. So they probably would be hiring at a pretty good clip compared to more established businesses. And I think that's kind of problematic for trying to make any kind of claim that AI actually adds jobs and doesn't kill jobs. I think it would have been much more interesting to look at on a per additional dollar of revenue basis, to what extent are these companies hiring? What does the actual productivity look like? Are they hiring above and below, what were the historical averages for that industry? They were really or if they'd looked at more mature businesses and had made that, and it was the same conclusion, maybe like mature businesses, if they were also hiring more as they adopted AI, that would be very interesting. That's not sort of what Ramp did here. And I'd also companies, I should say, that use Ramp, a lot of them tend to be kind of tech forward companies and younger companies. So again, I think you got to take this one with a grain of salt.
Yeah. I mean, this to me speaks to all of the studies about AI and unemployment at the moment. Like it's very difficult to track across various industries, various countries, like various job types. Like, I think there's a study, you can find a study to say absolutely anything about AI's effect on jobs at the moment, but it might just be a little bit too soon to tell where we are. Everything's still a little anecdotal, and how much of this is like executives holding off hiring until they kind of, for pressure to sort of boost productivity through AI. A lot of executives are holding off hiring until they can figure out how to implement AI. So there's just so many things at play. Whenever I get any of these studies about how AI is affecting jobs, I feel that it's a very hard thing to measure.
Yeah. One day we're going to have an answer to this question, but I think that day is not today.
I don't think so.
No. All right. I think that's all the time we have today on Fortune AI Weekly. Thank you so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe if you do, and we will see you next week.
Yes, thanks for listening.